I'm Mike Free, and I'm a member of TMS, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Utah and also the chair of the Department of Material Science and Engineering. And I'm here today at the TMS annual meeting in the lovely San Diego, and I have with me Dr. Fiona Doyle, who's been a longtime professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And we're here to do an oral history for AIME and TMS. And so we welcome you and appreciate the opportunity to be here. So we'll go ahead and get started with a question for Professor Doyle. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up?
So I'm not from California. I was born in the north of England in an industrial town called Newcastle. It's the Newcastle that you don't take coals to because there's a big, there used to be a big coal mining field there, and that then spawned a lot of heavy industry. I am the third of 5 children, and my parents, neither of them went to university. My father left school at 14 and did an apprenticeship and was an electrical draftsman. My mother left school at 16. The war had just broken out, and she worked in the land army. And after the war, she did 14 months of training, which qualified her to be a teacher in grade school. And so I grew up in this rambunctious, large family. We were very happy.
That's very interesting. It's a little bit of an unusual background for what we typically might see with the students and faculty that I'm aware of. But I think it's also interesting to take that a step further and talk about what kind of things influenced you to become an engineer.
Well, going long before then, Mike, you know, sort of I had an unconventional schooling for becoming an engineer. So I went to a convent school for 14 years. We don't have many TMS members who attended convent school for that long. I always, as long as I can remember though, I just loved science. And the British educational system was very different from the American one. So when I started middle school, I started physics and really liked it. And the year after, we started chemistry. And I look back and I think, golly, I was a really nerdy child because I remember in physics, we did this experiment. There were lots of hands-on stuff, which I think is a great way to educate children, just get them excited. And we grew an alum crystal. And I just thought this was so fascinating that you could organize how crystals grew, that I then went out and for months spent my allowance buying more alum and grew this huge crystal. This was my introduction to hydrometallurgy at the age of 12,
Wow.
Growing this enormous alum crystal at home. And in the process, I actually learned, you know, I figured out for myself, I didn't know what they were called, but I was observing nucleation and growth and was trying to control it. So this was fun to me. And then in the British system, once you get to 16, you do general exams and then you choose what you're going to do, just 3 subjects for your advanced level. And there was just no question that I was going to do science because that was what was fun and it was easy. And, you know, you didn't have to memorize, you just had to understand things, and you were fine. And so I did mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And when it came time to apply to university, there really weren't many people who were engineers or had gone into engineering from my school. Most of the girls who did science went into medicine. And I didn't want to do that because my older sister did that and it didn't look like fun. And so I thought about doing engineering, but I mean, I didn't really know any professional engineers. And I decided, no, I wanted to be a scientist. So I went off to Cambridge to do physics. And at Cambridge, you do natural sciences. And in my first year, I did a class called Crystalline Materials, which was offered jointly by the Materials Department and the Crystallography Department. And I thought that that was great fun. It was a lot like growing alum crystals, kind of on steroids, and learning a lot more about it. And so I continued doing that and ended up sort of specializing in metallurgy and material science. But that was not within the engineering department. In the process of doing that, I mean, my life has really just been sort of following what seemed fun. And I remember very clearly in lectures starting to hear about hydrometallurgy. I remember just being transfixed at the prospect of heap leaching when we were told about how you could sort of pour acid or cyanide over a whole heap of ore and actually produce metals on a scale. And I thought, this is really fun. I want to do more of this. So I did my final project doing that. And then I went to Imperial College and did a master's in extractive metallurgy and specialized in hydrometallurgy for my project. And John Monhemius, who was supervising my project, said, you really should think about doing a PhD, Fiona. And so I had really always wanted to work in industry, but I could not get a good job that used hydrometallurgy. At that point, really all of the hydrometallurgy jobs were in South Africa. And politically, at that time, I didn't want to work in South Africa. And also pragmatically, when I did an interview with Anglo, they said, well, if you're going to get ahead, you have to go underground, but we don't allow women underground. And so it seemed like a dead end. So staying to do a PhD seemed like a good thing to do. And in fact, when I finished my master's, I sort of noticed on the paperwork that it was a master's in engineering. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? I decided I wasn't going to be an engineer, and I've become an engineer. So that's how I actually got into engineering. It was following my interests, and somehow fate worked out so that even though I deliberately decided that I wasn't going to be an engineer, I ended up being an engineer.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting, your background, and especially a lot of this seems to be self-driven in terms of your interests and just following your passions. And it sounds like you've had a couple of maybe mentors along the way that have kind of helped to guide some of these decisions, and you've mentioned one already. Are there others that played a role in mentoring and helping you steer this direction?
So at Cambridge, there was a faculty member, Jim Charles. He was a pyrometallurgist, but he sort of took an interest in advising me. I attended a women's college at Cambridge, and there weren't any faculty fellows there who were in materials. And so Jim Charles was sort of my de facto advisor as an undergraduate. And he was the one who told me about the master's program at Imperial College, and he said, you know, I'll talk to my friend Jim Jeffs, who's getting this going, and I think that you'd be a good candidate for that. And so he sort of helped me along the way. And then at Imperial College, I did my research with John Monhemius. But Richard Birkin was the professor of the hydrometallurgy group, and John was a more junior faculty member. I actually deliberately decided to work with John rather than Richard Birkin, because Birkin had lots of students, John didn't have many. And being more junior, I figured that John had more of a vested interest in my success than Birkin had. So, and it was a very good decision. But Richard Birkin also, in a way, sort of took me under my wing. One of the things was he occasionally hosted very, very nice dinners for the whole hydrometallurgy group at his home. His wife was a wonderful cook, and it had a lovely house. in a garden, and I must have said the right things because I made comments about how wonderful the food was, because it was. It's really good. And I also was interested in the camellias and the azaleas and things like this. So I think he decided that I was okay because I had broad interests, and so he'd sometimes talk to me about food. I remember once he decided that I was looking particularly hungry, and he took me to lunch at the Café Royal, which was a wonderful experience. So, and then, he gave me professional advice along the way as well. And then when I got to Berkeley, I was lucky enough to have a few mentors. Jim Evans was the chair of the search committee, and he and his wife were very, very helpful in terms of helping me get settled, in this foreign country. And I mean, they've been lifelong friends. We're still good friends. Doug Fuster now, who was one of the early people featured in this oral history program, he was also a mentor. Doug, most people know, used to be rather gruff when he was younger. And I sort of either worked out or he wasn't going to be too gruff with me. Early on, my colleagues would send me to talk to Doug about difficult issues in the department. They sort of, so it's like, Fiona, go talk to Doug about this. And Doug was sort of a mentor, although he was sort of not so much a kind, gentle mentor as somebody who would come in and say, you really need to be writing more papers, Fiona. You'll never get tenure at this rate. And so on. And then another colleague, the late Neville Cook, who was a mining engineer and worked in rock mechanics, he also sort of took an interest in me as well and invited me to his group meetings and helped me understand how this whole American academia thing worked, because it was very different from the British system.
Good. That's very interesting. Maybe you can tell me just a little bit about your first job in industry. And it could tie into internships or whatever.
So my very first job in industry was actually when I was in high school. So as soon as, my family, I think best to describe it, we had modest means. And my parents always said, if you wanted things, well, we can't afford to do this for 5 of you, so you can wait until you're old enough to get a job, and then you can do these things. So as soon as I was old enough legally to work in Britain, the first summer I worked in retail, and it was very, very poorly paid. And the next year, I thought, well, I have skills. And I actually got myself a job as a lab technician doing analytical chemistry, supporting a drug development group at a local pharmaceutical company. And it was fun. I was doing all of these titrations. I also learned a lot of instrumentation. And I learned a lot of techniques that I continued to use throughout my career. The work convinced me that I didn't want to do chemistry, which is ironic since I ended up doing applied chemistry, but there we are. I certainly didn't want to spend my time doing quantitative or organic analysis. But that worked well, and I worked there for a couple of years in the summer. And then between my second and third years at Cambridge, and this was a 3-year undergraduate program, so it was sort of before my final exam, I decided that I'd like to, I should get a job doing metallurgy. And my father worked for a big company that did heavy engineering. And I knew that, I asked him, and he said, yes, that they did have a metallurgical department. And so I wrote, sort of asking for a summer job. And I'd written to various companies asking for summer jobs. And I'd always got letters back saying, no, thank you. And my male friends who were doing the same major, they were all getting jobs. And I thought, I wonder whether they just don't want women. And so I wrote to Clark Chapman's, and I mentioned that my father worked there and that I was, going into my final year doing metallurgy and materials at Cambridge. And I decided to just sign it FM Doyle. And the personnel department phoned up my father and said, oh, we understand that, your laddie wants a job here. I had not told my father that I was applying, by the way, just probably a faux pas, but, sort of, he had enough children, he rolled with the punches on these things. And they said, oh, it looks very interesting. So he's at Cambridge and, wants to do metallurgy. This sounds wonderful. And, continued for a little bit. And my father finally got a word in and said, well, yes, but it's not a laddie, it's my daughter. And they sort of, he said that he could tell that they took a deep breath and thought, oh, we can't say no now because it was illegal to discriminate against women. And so they proceeded and they gave me an interview, and so I started. And when I started, I was conscious of the fact that everybody was feeling very, very restrained and on their best behavior. And I sort of, a few days into it, I was preparing some samples and I stamped one with the wrong stamp and I let out an expletive. And, I apologized, of course. And the guy who was in the same lab as me sort of left. And what I learned afterwards was that they were told that they could not swear in my presence. And as soon as I swore, he walked out and said, it's okay, she swears. And then everybody was a lot more relaxed, that they could actually just treat me like a co-worker. And so that I spent the summer, I was doing a project on liquid metal embrittlement. It was shortly after there'd been a big disaster, which I seem to recall had some fatalities, in a power plant that had Clark Chapman equipment in it. And they had sort of tracked down the failure to being liquid metal embrittlement of the steel by some galvanized wire that was in the structure. And so they wanted a better understanding of liquid metal embrittlement so that they can ensure that they weren't going to have any problems going forward. So I was working on that, and I spent most of the summer preparing metallographic specimens and then looking at them down a microscope and doing, microscale indentation and all of those other things. And at the end of that, I decided that physical metallurgy wasn't for me, so that then I definitely had to do chemical metallurgy.
Let's talk just a little bit about this transition in going from your academic studies and transitioning to your professional life. What can you tell me about some of the challenges you faced and maybe what you did to kind of overcome those challenges?
Well, even before we talk about the transition to what I'm doing, I talked about the fact that I didn't want to be an engineer. I also emphatically did not want to be an academic. In fact, I used to say that I had to get out of universities before they discovered that I wasn't very smart. And I really wanted to work in industry. And unfortunately, the year that I finished my PhD, the economy was pretty depressed. The previous year, there were a few people from the Hydromet group who had got fantastic jobs because oil companies had been buying up mining companies. And British Petroleum had a big Hydromet lab in the south of England. And quite a few people had gone there, and these seemed like fantastic jobs. I really wanted to do that. But they stopped hiring before I was on the job market. And I applied for various other jobs. There was one job available in extractive metallurgy in the UK, and it was at the Avonmouth lead smelter and I was informed that they would not employ women of childbearing age. And I said to my advisor, to John Monhelius, I said, well, isn't that illegal? And he said, Fiona, if it's not safe for women of childbearing age, I think the people who should be concerned about legalities are men who are working there, because the ambient lead probably isn't too great for them as well. So I ended up sort of thinking, well, what am I going to do? And I was looking at a couple of job offers that were fine, but they weren't for a PhD level. They were actually bachelor's level jobs. And I sort of noticed in those days jobs, there was no internet. It's really hard to remember what it was like, but jobs used to be advertised in periodicals and, in Journal of Metals. I saw these advertisements for academic jobs in the United States, and all they seemed to want was a PhD. And in the United Kingdom, you had to have several years as a postdoc to even be considered for a lecturer job. And I did not want to do a postdoc. So I thought, well, I'll apply to some of those jobs in the United States. And I did. And, much to my surprise, I landed a job at Berkeley. And at that point, I had no idea of the academic reputation of Berkeley. I was totally clueless about the American system. And it was, it was sort of like, the Groucho Marx line about not wanting to belong to a club that would have you as a member. I figured, well, if Berkeley's taking me straight out of my PhD, they can't be very good academically. And so it was only when I got there that I actually realized that, this actually is a very good place. Interestingly, I had always wanted to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, not always. When I was 14 and was doing geography, I'm a real map nerd. And I used to stare at the atlas, and we were doing North America, and I'd look at the map of California and think, this looks really cool. I want to live there. And then it was, I'm going to live there. I had no idea how I was going to do it, but getting a job at Berkeley was a way to sort of live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that was another of the advantages. And, I sort of got to Berkeley, and I was clueless about the American system. I had to start teaching graduate classes, and because of the British system, I had taken some master's level classes, but there's no coursework as part of a PhD in the British system. The attitude is, well, all of the information is in the library and you know how to read, so just go to the library and you find out what you need to, which is one approach, but it doesn't prepare you well for teaching graduate level classes. So, that was sort of a learning process. And, my colleagues were very, very supportive. I mean, one of the sort of, I suppose I look back on it, and one of the big challenges, quite apart from the fact that I didn't understand the American system, was that I was the first woman in my department. And I was the only woman in my department for 19 years. I was department chair before we hired another woman. And I was only the third female faculty member in the College of Engineering. So, I was sort of this peculiarity. And fortunately, people were very, very gracious. I never experienced any harassment or any sort of what I would describe as discriminatory behavior in our department. At the same time, I look back and realize, oh yes, I had colleagues who were networking, playing golf and things, and they never invited me. And they would go off to the faculty club bar and, sort of I was never invited to these things. So I definitely missed out on some of the networking. And I think that one of the reasons why both my colleague Neville Cook and Doug Fustenau took me under their wing is that both of them had daughters about my age. And I think that they could see that it was different for me, and they wanted to sort of stretch out a fatherly hand to help me and, you know, give me some pointers on how to navigate an academic career. And I'm very, very grateful to them for having done that. Yes, sort of. By the time we did hire another woman, as I said, I was department chair, and we had email at that point. You know, we had moved into the modern age. And I used to enjoy sending memos to my colleagues, particularly when I was department chair, and I would just always address it to gentlemen. And when we hired another female professor, I had to stop and start saying, oh, colleagues, rather than gentlemen. It was just sort of how it was. It was very, very male-dominated.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you said that you were the first woman in your department for a long time, and you had some help with the mentoring and stuff. Were there other things that the university did or others on campus that helped to make it easier to connect and to feel more a part of the community as a woman in engineering?
Yes. So early on, Berkeley had two provosts. There was one for most of campus, and there was one for the professional schools and colleges. And when I got to Berkeley, the provost for the professional schools and colleges was a woman. And so it was either once a year or once a semester. She would invite the female faculty members in engineering to lunch, and we'd sit around a small table in the faculty club. And you know, that way I did get to meet the other women, and there were a few more added sort of within a year or so of my arriving. And I had one colleague in particular, her name was Pam Ibeck. She was an assistant professor in mechanical engineering, and she got tenure and then left and ended up as the president at the University of the Pacific. She decided that she was much more interested in teaching rather than research, and so she pursued a career track that would be more focused on teaching and education. But in the early days, Pam and I used to get together very frequently and vent about how outrageous our colleagues were. And she always had much more outrageous stories about the colleagues in mechanical engineering than I had about the ones in material science and mineral engineering. And I mean, we really did sort of help each other and, you know, help each other keep sane. And one of the sanest pieces of advice that I ever got was from Pam. And I remember her saying, as we were sort of both looking at tenure, she said, I'm working as hard as I want to work. And if that's not enough to get tenure, then I don't want tenure. And I thought, well, that's a really good way of looking at it. And you know, I obviously still remember her words because I think that they really capture, you know, the sort of part of the sort of importance of maintaining work-life balance. And I think that that's very important to have a productive academic career. You know, it's not just ensuring that you're a happy person, but I think that that balance is very important, and balance is something that I've always tried to you know, ensure that my students followed as well, because particularly for a graduate student, their research is, you know, this is the focus of their existence at the moment. And if you've got nothing else going on in your life, as you know, research has its ups and downs. And when your research project hits a down, if that's all there is, it's a very miserable place to be. And I mean, subsequently, when I was the vice provost for graduate studies at Berkeley, I really saw the statistics on the incidence of mental illness among graduate students. I didn't know those in the earlier days, but I could see that it was very important for students to maintain that balance. And so friends early on sort of helped me keep that balance. Also, there was a network of female professors at Berkeley, because there weren't that many female professors in the early 1980s either. And that also sort of helped me maintain perspective. And early on, I got involved in our academic senate, which I enjoyed because it was engaged in thoughtful matters outside of my immediate department, and I enjoyed the balance of that. And I did eventually become the vice chair and the chair of our academic senate, which was an interesting chapter of my career. What I would say there is that the biggest shock that I had becoming chair of our academic senate was realizing, and this is such a no-brainer, it should have occurred to me earlier, that most faculty don't think like engineers. And sort of having that sort of brought home to me, then I think set me up for being an administrator at the campus level, and realized that engineers do tend to think in a sort of logical way. We don't always agree, but we will typically use a certain process to get through differences of opinion and get down to solving the problems. And there are some people who just love analyzing the situation and don't even want to admit that there's a problem. But before I leave the topic of what helped me and what did not help me, one thing that was a real difficulty being one of the first female faculty members in engineering was that when I was expecting my daughter, who's my older child, so this was 1991, I inquired of my department administrator, the manager. I said, do we have maternity leave? And she said, oh, no, I'm pretty sure we don't have maternity leave. And so I thought, okay, all right, I have lots of sabbatical credits. And so I arranged to take a sabbatical leave for the semester after my daughter was born. And which I did, and I didn't get very much research done, as you can imagine. And when she was 9 months old, the university published a booklet. This was pre-internet days. It was a booklet of, support for university employees. And I was reading through this, and I saw that there was indeed maternity leave. It was just that our manager had no idea that there was maternity leave, because nobody at the College of Engineering had ever needed maternity leave before. By the time my son was born, I was able to avail myself of our maternity leave policies, which weren't as generous as they are now, but at least there was something. And I'm so glad that things are a lot better now for parents.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So how did you, let's come back to this situation that you're talking about with, having a family and you're talking about work-life balance. How did you juggle the other demands in life as you went and worked along in your profession? What are some things that were very helpful for you in terms of managing that work-life balance?
Friends. I'm from the UK, and my parents and all my family were in the UK. And so there was nobody from my side of the family available to help me. And my husband is from Michigan, and his parents were there and were older. And they really couldn't do very much traveling either. So they weren't available to step in when children were sick or whatever. Fortunately, when I was expecting my daughter, the house next door to ours was sold, and the couple who bought it, I still remember meeting Pat on our front lawn, and she had a bump as big as my bump, and we were both expecting our first. And her son was born it was a month after my daughter Catherine was born. And we decided that we would share a nanny, and that worked quite well. And so Pat and her husband were also a long way from home. Her husband is from Australia, and Pat's father was a quadriplegic in Georgia, and so her parents couldn't travel at all. And so we became each other's backup. When the children got chicken pox, at that point they were in the same daycare, and so they got chicken pox at the same time. And we would take it in turns to look after these hordes of children, the 4 children that couldn't go to daycare. There were also many other friends as well. And one of the things that I realized very early on is you never pass up the opportunity to volunteer to help somebody when you can, volunteer to give somebody's child a ride and so on, because then you can ask people for help when you need it, or more likely they will just volunteer to help out. And that was so enormously helpful. I don't think I could have made it without that. And of course, my husband, fortunately, was very supportive of my career. I could not have done it without him. I say this kind of as an afterthought. He was pretty important. He worked at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, which is about a 40-minute drive from our home in Oakland. And so he used to go to work early. I'd get the children ready, and then to daycare or to school. And then he would do the pickup in the evenings so that I could work later. And there was an awful lot of balancing there. We used to have to negotiate when we went to conferences and all of those other things so that we could sort of get through.
Yeah, that was challenging, I'm sure. So,
and I mean, that aspect of life is as challenging now. We have better parental leave policies, but in this country, it's still really hard for dual income families to raise children. Yeah. And in the Bay Area, it's very, very difficult to raise a family on a single income. Yeah. Just because the cost of living is so high.
Yeah. Well, with just a little bit more, maybe we could go into this work-life balance. So were there other things? You had a lot of support with friends and your spouse, and and it's challenging even at that. But were there any other things that you had that helped you with the work-life balance aspect of maintaining that semblance of, having that balance?
As I mentioned earlier, I did have some work-life balance even before I had children. I was doing different things. Fixing up my house was a big time sink, sort of teaching myself how to do various things. And again, there were no YouTube videos showing you how to do sheetrock or things like that. But I discovered that, sort of finishing off sheetrock is actually awfully like frosting a cake. And so if you can frost a cake, you can do walls. It's really the same skills. And I've always enjoyed the outdoors and hiking and things like that. So when I was, when my children were, sort of particularly young and, needed a lot more attention, other things in my life didn't happen, but I was able to, keep work going at a reasonable pace.
Well, let's take a little bit of time and talk about some of your research, some of the things that you're passionate about, some things that you've really enjoyed in terms of the research you've done over the years.
So I think in order to understand kind of where I've been going in the various, lots of different things that I've done, I have to go back to being a teenager. And I remember, even though I'd never intended doing this, there was a couple of books that I read that I have really influenced the way that I have approached all the research in my career. I remember reading a book early on about environmental impacts of manufacturing and everything else. You know, this would have been the time of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It wasn't that, but I can't even remember the name of the book. But you know, I remember sort of becoming aware of the environment. And that actually wasn't very hard to do because the countryside around Newcastle still had refuse heaps from coal mining. And you would drive by these, you know, the mines might have been closed, but you would drive by these and you'd see, you know, acid mine drainage coming off them, and some of them smelled to high heaven because there was a lot of pyrite in the coal. And, you know, this was oxidizing, and there'd be sulfuric acid and, you know, from lower down, hydrogen sulfide and stuff like this. So, you know, these were an eyesore, and I was very much aware of them. And there was a lot of air pollution in Newcastle when I was a child. You know, I remember my mother talking about hanging washing out to dry, because nobody ever had, no, we didn't have dryers in those days. And, you know, the clothes just being covered in soot before she could bring them in. I mean, we heated our house with coal as well. So, you know, I was aware of the environment. And then I also read a book about the fact that, that we were, you know, society was going to run out of resources, and there were all these projections that we were going to run out of copper by, you know, 2000 and various other things. And, you know, that's made an influence, you know, an impact on me. I thought, oh, right, you know, this could be a problem. And so these are things that have been at the back of my mind, you know, sort of really throughout my career. And I would say that the one common theme of the research that I have done has been an interest in improving the environmental impact of producing raw materials. I was very much aware of the fact that you need mining because we need raw materials. But at the same time, we want to produce our raw materials in a way that doesn't damage the environment. And lots of the disparate things that I've done have been along the, you know, sort of that theme. Low impact. So, you know, in my PhD work, which was working on, it was a process called hydrolytic stripping, and the concept was that if you removed iron from, say, a zinc-producing circuit by solvent extraction, rather than precipitating jarosite or goethite, then you would eventually have an iron residue that wasn't as contaminated as jarosite and goethites were at that time. And that was appealing. And then John Monhemius and Gunnar Thorsen had sort of basically discovered this process whereby if you take a carboxylic acid that's loaded with iron and hit it with water at high temperature and pressure, you will precipitate out iron as a clean hematite or goethite. I did my master's project doing goethites and jarosite. and then I went to the sort of higher temperature process for my PhD, we were actually putting in cobalt and nickel and producing what we would now call nanocrystals of spinel ferrites. We didn't use the term nanocrystals in those days, but that's what they were. And I actually became very interested in the concept of using hydrometallurgy as a way of producing value-added products. And this reflected my education in materials. And so I was interested in, rather than just producing raw materials that would then be processed again and again to produce final products, I was interested in the concept of, well, can we produce products at the mine site or at the processing site that are further down the line towards final products, so that we can miss out some of the processing and the reprocessing. So I actually did quite a lot of work on precipitating different products from solvent extractants. I worked on producing rare earths where you could actually control the morphology and size of crystals, which is important for phosphors and some of the applications of rare earths back, when dinosaurs were roaming the earth, and I was in the early stages of my career, as opposed to now when we're, talking about renewable energy and hybrid vehicles and all these other things that we still need rare earths for. We need a lot more rare earths than we ever did before. I did, just sort of on the topic of rare earths, I did this wonderful consulting project for General Electric. And they were interested in using permanent magnets for MRI machines to sell in countries where the electrical supply was intermittent, so they couldn't run electromagnets all the time. And at that point, the rare earth magnets were very expensive. And so they worked with an institute in Baotou in China, and I was the consultant on that project. And we developed a process for producing a mixed neodymium praseodymium product that could then go directly into magnets as opposed to separating them out. So again, it was making the whole processing more efficient. And I have a Chinese patent out of that work. And so that was an interesting foray into rare earths. So shortly after I arrived at Berkeley, I decided that I needed to do some leaching work, because every self-respecting hydrometallurgist has to have some leaching work under their belt. So I conceived this idea of translating my expertise on how iron precipitated to the direct leaching of zinc sulfide in autoclaves. And the fall after I arrived at Berkeley, Ernie Peters was there doing a sabbatical leave. And he was interested in this. He had lots of experience in the area. And we sort of gave me some pointers. And that helped me get that project off the ground. He enjoyed having a hydrometallurgist there, and he would sometimes come into my office and regale me with stories of his past, and gave me the history of pressure leaching in Canada, where of course it all started. And so that was very helpful. And I also, with him, did a project that he conceived, and I then joined it, on mathematical modeling of the leaching kinetics of zinc calcine. So that actually gave me exposure to a type of mathematical modeling that I wasn't familiar with as well. So that was very educational to me. In terms of other projects that I have enjoyed, I suppose going away from hydrometallurgy a bit, something that has almost become a lifelong hobby, is that in the mid-80s, one of my colleagues landed this project that was commissioned by the California legislature to do a study of the environmental impact of abandoned mines in California. And so this was a guy called Mike Cook, who was a mining engineer. And he put together a team. I was on it. We had an environmental lawyer, some policy people. And we looked at lots of abandoned mines in California. There were, at that point, I think, 2 or 3 that were on the federal Superfund list, and then California had its own Superfund list. And I got very, very interested in particularly acid mine drainage, which, as I mentioned, I'd observed as a child on the refuse heaps from the coal mining in Northumberland. And I like the outdoors, I like hiking, and I discovered just how delightful it is to traipse around California looking at these environmental disasters as a result of mining in times when people weren't as enlightened as they are now. And the history of California, from the gold rush on, is so colored by mining and everything else. It was just absolutely fascinating to me. My husband is very, very patient with my desire to, stop the car and go and take a look at, oh, that looks like a mine over there. Let's go and smell the acid mine drainage and the sulfur and everything else. And, my family just says, oh, yeah, it's mom's
Here's
at
another
it,
one.
mom's at it again. And Steve acts a bit as my guardian angel. He says, I don't think this is a good place for you to go walking around, Fiona. There might be somebody with a shotgun. You need to think about that.
Safety first.
So I, have also done work on acid mine drainage, and this fits into the environmental theme of, working out how you can actually mine sulfidic material and do it in a way that you then don't end up with acid mine drainage. I don't like causing problems. Other work that I've done is also addressed at the cleaning up the effluents from mining and mineral processing plants. Particularly, I've done work on using supported liquid membranes, and I did some work on encapsulating the extractants within supported liquid membranes for removing metal ions as they can be, as one can clean up waste streams. I'd never done anything in flotation in graduate school, but I got interested in the concept of ion flotation, which is really misnomered because it's not like flotation at all, other than that there are bubbles in there. And so I worked with Doug on one ion flotation project, and then spun off another one with an incredibly gifted student who he was responsible for all of the brain work. But we, I say we, I did have some influence, went back and looked at ion flotation kinetics in terms of the adsorption isotherms of metal ion surfactant complexes on the bubble. And we're able to demonstrate that the rate controlling step in ion flotation is the adsorption of the ion surfactant complexes onto bubbles. And curiously, in the early days, a lot of ion flotation work was done in columns because people had flotation columns for minerals and thought big and long. And what we discovered was that in ion flotation, everything happens in the first meter or so. And so to come up with an effective ion flotation reactor, you actually need something that's wide and fairly shallow. You don't need a big high column. And getting down into the fundamentals of that was very, very interesting. Going away from hydrometallurgy, I had 10 years in which, it was about 10 years, in which I worked on chemical mechanical planarization, which is the process for, I was working principally on copper CMP, and this is the process for smoothing the metallic interlayers in the production of integrated circuits. And when this was first developed, it was very much a head scratcher in terms of people couldn't work out why it worked. People thought that it was sort of sacrilege to take, integrated circuits that have been processed in these super clean environments and then expose them to this wet slurry with aggressive chemicals and particles. And you would end up with an atomically flat layer of copper if everything is working properly. And with several students over the course of 10 years working in very, very close partnership with a colleague, Dave Dornfeld, in mechanical engineering, we got to the point of at the nano level describing the kinetics of it. And it truly is coupling of electrochemistry and the mechanical phenomena at the nano level. It was very, very interesting. And that's a project that it's bittersweet to me because before we'd actually published the final papers on that, Dave died very suddenly of a heart attack. And so I actually, published his work, now a joint work, and it was posthumously done. And he was just sort of a lovely guy. I really enjoyed working with him. And sometimes a student would be in mechanical engineering and sometimes they'd be in materials, but we had, regardless of the home department of the student, they'd be in both group meetings and sort of broad, enriching the culture of both research groups. It was very nice. And I've done quite a lot of collaborative work, and I really enjoy that.
That's good. That's fun to have those interdisciplinary kind of groups going on. I've had some of those too. That's been fun. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about some of the technical challenges that you've seen in your career and maybe some of your thoughts about the future of what we need to do to overcome some challenges. So maybe some just personally on your group and technical challenges you've had, but also just more in terms of the industry and where they're going, what challenges they face, and maybe some ideas on that end.
Well, in terms of technical challenges in my group, I think not enough funding is definitely an ongoing challenge. And fortunately, I'm fairly resourceful. And so I do recall in the early days of my ion flotation work, having some fairly wild and crazy ideas and basically rigging up reactors out of used milk, with the plastic milk jugs and things.
That's creative.
It was, yes. And I've done, I remember Michelle Matheson doing some work on, it was column leaching of some mining waste that it was pyrite rich. And we ended up using used Coca-Cola bottles, the 2-liter ones, inverted as the columns. And they actually worked very well. So so we have been creative. I think doing work on a shoestring has been
resourceful.
has been sort of one of the themes there. In terms of technical challenges, and particularly looking to the future, and this is where I get very worried. When I look at where the world needs to go to address climate change, mining and mineral processing and metallurgy are enormously important. And I think we will get there. But when you look at the change in the materials supply stream that's necessary, for example, to reach the goals of electrifying our vehicles and so on, we need to have step changes in our production of lithium, rare earths for the for various different kinds of renewable energy sources, and the list goes on. And I really worry about the fact that we don't see that many students who are interested in the primary industries, and they truly are crucial for the future of humanity. I know that sounds like an extremely grandiose statement, but I honestly believe that. I don't use grandiose statements lightly. I'm currently the chair of the Earth Resources Engineering section in the National Academy of Engineering, and we have a lot of members who are very forward-thinking, and we have frequent discussions about how can we help to actually move the needle on it's sort of changing the global mineral industry to deal with needs. And I use the word global with a lot of sort of deliberation here, because we often talk about we need more domestic supplies so that we're not dependent on given countries that are producing critical minerals. But in order to address climate change, the whole world has to adopt renewable energy and cleaner transportation. And so it's not a question of, well, this country is okay and they're limiting their supplies. We need to be thinking about this as a problem on a global stage. And, and unfortunately, the international political state at the moment is hardly conducive to solving humanity's problems on a global level. And that's where we need to be. But, without question, hydrometallurgy, the whole materials production is going to be very, very busy for a long time if we're going to save the planet and save the human race.
Good. Well, let's go ahead and we'll move on into another aspect of your career, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the awards and recognition that you've received, and maybe you can just comment a little bit about. I don't think you need to talk about very many things, but what have been some of the meaningful awards and recognitions that you've received, and maybe why it's been helpful or impactful for you?
Well, one of the early awards that I got, and it was a relatively, it's not sort of a national award or anything, but the University of British Columbia has, or was having an annual, I think it was an extractive metallurgy lecture, and I was one of the recipients of that. And that was incredibly meaningful to me because the UBC hydrometallurgy group is so distinguished and so on. To be recognized by them was really special. And that certificate has Keith Brimmercomb's name on it. He was the department chair at the time, I think. And so just because he was such a special person, that was very, very meaningful.
Were there any others that seemed to have some impact for you?
Certainly. I just caught the beginning of the TMS Extraction and Processing Lecturer Award, and that was a very, very meaningful one to me. I was the first woman, I believe, to get that award. And I remember reading the paper from Ernie Peters' award. And I remember I think it was in one of the TMS publications, and it said, this is an award made to the, and it said, to the man who is most distinguished, or something like that, but it mentioned man. And I thought, well, that's a bit harsh. Does that mean that I'm not eligible for this? But fortunately, TMS was more enlightened by the time anybody was thinking that I might possibly be a recipient of that award. I also, the Milt Wadsworth Award at SME was also incredibly meaningful. I first met Milt when I was a grad student at a NATO conference in Cambridge that Romeo Batista organized. I also met Oseo Osore for the first time there, and we've been good friends since. But Milt, at that conference, he looked so quintessentially American. He had checkered pants, which at that point, nobody in Britain wore checkered pants. And he gave a couple of great talks as well. And it was then that I started to realize just what a giant in the field Milt was. And so sort of to get that award was just very, very special. Becoming a TMS fellow was also very, very special. TMS has been very, very, I'd say, good to me and good for me. In my early days, it was wonderful to come to meetings. And at that point, a lot of my friends from grad school would be at the meeting. And so I'd sort of get to see old friends. And of course, I made new friends. So TMS made me the chair of the hydrometallurgy committee fairly early on. And that got me onto the EPD Council. One of the awards that was definitely the most surprising was being elected to National Academy of Engineering. And that happened, I was elected in 2016. And at that point, I was a full-time administrator at Berkeley. And I'd made my peace with the fact that I probably wouldn't get many more professional awards. And to be elected totally out of the blue was very special. Because NAE, its mission is to serve the nation. And so...
So what is NAE for people?
National Academy of Engineering. So it's a big honor, but also it affords you an opportunity to make a difference for the country. And I'm currently the chair of the Earth Resources Engineering section, and I'm active in quite a few other of the committees of the National Academy of Engineering, and I'm finding that very, very rewarding.
Well, maybe we can go in a little bit more to talk about these professional societies that you've been involved with, and you mentioned in particular that TMS has been good for you with some of the opportunities that it's provided to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those opportunities, how they've helped your career, and how you first heard about TMS?
Well, the first time I heard about TMS, I was actually incredibly exasperated. I was doing studying literature for my PhD, and I saw a reference to a paper that was for TMS, and it was some conference proceeding. And so I went to the library and was trying to find it on the index cards, and just couldn't get anywhere. And I went back to the lab and said to somebody, I'm trying to find this reference, it's for TMS. And they said, yeah, the T is for the. And I said, oh, could they not pick a proper name? So that was actually my first encounter with TMS. When I came to Berkeley, when I was a grad student, I belonged to some professional societies in the United Kingdom. I'm still a member of IMM. But when I came here, Jim Evans suggested that I join TMS, and I think he sponsored my application. And so I started coming to TMS meetings very regularly. And I benefited enormously from the technical programming. I learned a lot. But I also met a lot of people who had similar interests, which was enormously helpful. And then I got involved in the committees, and people put their trust in me, probably because nobody else was volunteering to do things. But in looking back at my career, I can see that TMS was actually gave me my first administrative experience. And as somebody whose career went heavily in an administrative direction, TMS actually was enormously helpful and useful for giving me confidence in my ability to organize people, to manage things, to juggle lots of balls that weren't necessarily technical. Putting together the technical program is a challenge, and sort of being there and doing it gave me a lot of very useful experience. So being elected as a fellow of the society is just a huge honor, very, very meaningful.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, so what would you give as advice, like for young professionals, students, in terms of what they could get out of becoming a member of TMS or another organization? I mean, this whole thing is under the umbrella of AIME, but what kind of advice would you give to students and professionals that are just starting their careers?
Definitely make a point of going to the meetings, but get involved. The programs have information about when technical committees are meeting. These are not exclusive entities. I think sort of all of the committees really happy to have people show up, especially if they show up and volunteer to do stuff. And all you have to do is raise your hand to do stuff, and folks will say, thank you very much, and they'll help you. And that way you get to broaden your professional circle. It really goes back to what I said earlier about juggling work-life balance. Don't pass up the opportunity to help. And if you extend your hand to help people, then actually other people help you. And it works professionally just as much as it does in your personal life.
Yeah, no, I've found the same thing to be true. I've really enjoyed my association with TMS, and it's been a good thing for me. So do you have any thoughts about what can be done to attract young people to the industry in general?
I think it's a very hard problem, but material science is finally now a recognized discipline. For so many years, it really wasn't. People would say, what? What is that? And you'd have to explain. And now it's realized. And there's a huge amount of coolness in some of the work that's being done. I was looking through the technical program for the meeting last night, and some of the talks just sound absolutely fascinating. And I think that knowledge of how intellectually exciting the field is, in conjunction with, I think we need to do a better job of talking about its importance for sort of the future of society, to allow us to deal with climate change, to stop it, and to ensure that globally people have a good standard of living. There's so much good that can come from it. And I think that there are many students who want to have an impact in the world. And I think that if we can do a better job of explaining how this is a very good track to make an impact, I think we'll be successful.
Yeah, I think it's very good. I like that thought, and I agree with you on that. So looking at your career, as we kind of wrap this up, what are there things in your career that, you've had a lot of different experiences, are there things that you would maybe do differently, or things that, because of your experience, you look back and say, maybe I wish I would have done this a little differently, or taken a little different track on this or that?
That's an interesting question. I actually believe in trying not to second guess what you would have done differently. I probably would have been better at delegating more in general, and particularly delegating writing papers more to my students. I would have more publications if I hadn't insisted on being very, very comfortable with them before they went to be reviewed.
Okay.
And my students will probably say, yeah, we should just let
it go.
Do a bit more, yes.
Doesn't have to be perfect to go out the door. So are there things that if you look at your career and kind of sum it up in a really brief statement of just a few words, how would you describe it?
It's been a wild ride. And part of it has been the fact that I get bored fairly easily, which is hard to admit, because when I was a child, if we ever said that we were bored, my mother would say, well, if you're bored, I'll find you some work to do. And so we never dared say that we were bored. But I like the variety of starting new projects and doing something fun and then moving on to something else. And I've also found that administrative positions, after a few years in an administrative position, I kind of get bored with it and want to move on to something else. And I've done that. And so, perhaps sort of the pithy description of my career has been, it's a cure for boredom.
Well, it's good. It's good. Well, it's fun that you can follow your passion. It's been fun to interview you and learn about some of your experiences. Is there anything else that you would like to comment on, or?
I'd like to thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to do this. It's been fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been fun for me too.